The snow still fell heavy in the Ardennes that December of 1944. The world seemed to groan under the weight of war. For weeks the thunder of artillery and the stutter of machine guns had shaken the frozen forests. The Battle of the Bulge was reaching its brutal crescendo, and for every soldier standing, a dozen lay wounded in barns, cellars, and hastily dug holes in the earth. Among those caught in the chaos were 3 German doctors, medical officers of the Wehrmacht, who had marched with their retreating units through a storm of fire and confusion. They had treated men with frostbitten feet, lungs filled with cold air, and wounds black with infection. They carried no illusions about their fate. When their convoy was overrun near the village of Saint-Vith, they were pulled from the wreckage with pistols at their hips but bandages still in their packs. The American soldiers who surrounded them wore hard expressions, rifles steady, faces rimmed red with cold. The German doctors expected what every captured officer was trained to expect: interrogation, humiliation, maybe a bullet in the snow. Rumors had long circulated in their ranks that captured German medics were executed on the spot, accused of prolonging the war by patching up men who should have been left to die. Fear coiled in their stomachs as they were shoved into a barn converted into a holding pen. Inside, hay dust floated in shafts of winter light, mixing with the stink of blood and sweat. The sound hit them first: groaning, coughing, a wet rasp that seemed to come from every shadow. The barn wasn't just a prison. It was a field hospital. Rows of stretchers lay across the straw, each occupied by an American soldier torn apart by battle. Bandages soaked crimson, hands trembling with fever, eyes rolling beneath lids. One of the doctors, Oberstabsarzt Friedrich Keller, froze at the sight. He had served in field hospitals from Warsaw to Normandy. He knew the smell of gangrene, the look of shock in a dying man's face. But these were not Germans. These were his enemy, boys in uniforms marked with stars and stripes. An American officer approached, a major with mud crusted on his boots and exhaustion etched into his eyes. He barked an order, and a translator repeated it in clipped German. "You are doctors. You will treat our wounded." For a moment, silence swallowed the barn. The German doctors exchanged looks. This was a trick, surely. First, the Americans would force them to touch their wounded, then accuse them of sabotage, poisoning, malpractice. The punishment would be swift, execution cloaked in legality. Dr. Keller whispered to the man beside him, "Hauptmann Arzt Ernst Vogel, Sie wollen uns benutzen, dann erschießen." They want to use us, then shoot us. Vogel gave a tight nod, eyes narrowed in suspicion. But the major said nothing more. He simply gestured toward the stretchers, his jaw set in a grim line. The translator repeated, "If you refuse, you will be left outside in the snow." The doctors hesitated only a moment longer. For men who had dedicated their lives to medicine, the instinct to heal was stronger than the instinct to hate. Slowly, Keller stepped forward, his hands trembling as he opened the satchel still strapped to his side. A vial of morphine, a roll of bandages, scissors dull with use. The first soldier he bent over was a young American private, no older than his own son. A bullet had torn through the boy's thigh. Infection raged, swelling the flesh into angry shades of red and purple. The stench was unbearable. Keller adjusted his spectacles, steadied his breath, and began to work. He cleaned the wound, cut away dead tissue, applied fresh dressings. He moved with the same precision he had used on German soldiers for years. The only difference was the insignia O on the boy's torn sleeve. The barn filled with a strange silence as American medics watched their captives bend over the wounded. One GI muttered under his breath, "Can't believe Krauts are saving our boys." Another replied, "Better them than no one." Suspicion hung thick in the air, but desperation outweighed mistrust. The American doctors were stretched thin, half their staff dead or scattered. Every pair of skilled hands was needed, even enemy ones. By nightfall, the German doctors had treated dozens of Americans. They worked with a grim determination, their own survival hanging in the balance. Vogel stitched a stomach wound by lantern light, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the cold. Another, Dr. Matthias Adler, massaged the chest of a soldier struggling to breathe, whispering prayers in German as though the words could cross the chasm of language. In a corner of the barn, Keller pulled a blooded diary from the uniform of a dying GI. He opened it with trembling fingers, unsure why he bothered. Inside were scribbled lines in English, barely legible. Through the translation of a nearby medic, he pieced together fragments: letters to a mother, hopes of returning to Kansas to see the wheat harvest, prayers for forgiveness. Keller closed the book slowly, his throat tight. The enemy had a mother too. Outside, snow muffled the world, but inside the barn, the war sounded different. Moans of pain, the hiss of lanterns, the clink of surgical tools. Death did not care for languages or flags. As dawn broke, Keller expected the inevitable. A firing squad in the snow, perhaps after one last use of their skills. Yet when the barn doors opened, no rifles waited. Instead, another stretcher was dragged in, this one bearing a German soldier barely clinging to life. His uniform was tattered, his face pale as chalk. The American major pointed at the Germans. "Yours, treat him." The doctors froze. For hours they had bent over Americans, stitching, bandaging, trying to keep them alive. Now their own countryman was laid before them, eyes glazed with shock. Keller's heart twisted. He turned to the major, words spilling in halting English. "If we help him, you kill him?" The major shook his head. The translator spoke softly. "No, he lives if you can save him." Keller looked back down at the German soldier, then at the rows of American stretchers. The realization struck him with force. The Americans were not using them as tools for mockery or execution. They were recognizing them as doctors. Their enemy, yes, but also men bound to an oath that stretched beyond uniforms. That night, as they sat in a corner of the barn eating thin rations of bread and broth, Vogel whispered to Keller, "This is not the war we were told about. The Americans, they treat us not as animals, but as men." Keller said nothing. His hands still shook from the surgeries, from the shock of mercy. He stared at the lantern flame, wondering what history would remember, the thunder of guns or the quiet sound of a needle piercing thread into flesh. The snowstorms came harder in late December, piling against barns, clogging roads, muffling even the sounds of war. But inside the makeshift American field station, where the 3 German doctors now worked, there was no silence. The air throbbed with groans, the scrape of metal basins, the low bark of orders half heard in English and half interpreted into clipped German. For Dr. Friedrich Keller, every hour blurred into the next. He had expected captivity to mean chains, perhaps interrogations, maybe a quick execution. Instead, it meant moving from stretcher to stretcher, pressing down on arterial bleeding, stitching with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion, measuring doses of morphine with eyes gritty from sleepless nights. On Christmas morning, he found himself hunched over an American lieutenant with a shredded arm. The man's face was pale, his lips cracked, but his eyes burned with fear. Keller whispered as he worked, not in English, which he barely spoke, but in the language of reassurance all patients know. A soft tone, a steady breath. The weight of a hand pressed against the shoulder to remind the body it was not alone. The lieutenant survived. Keller was not sure if the credit belonged to medicine or sheer will. Beside him, Ernst Vogel worked with quiet fury. His fingers were blunt and sure as he tied off sutures, but his mind spun with doubt. "We save them," he muttered to Keller in German when the night grew still. "And tomorrow they march forward and kill more of ours. Tell me, Fritz, what kind of victory is that?" Keller had no answer. He only stared at the lantern flame until his eyes watered, then bent to the next wound. Matthias Adler, the third of the trio, tried to steady their spirits. He hummed hymns under his breath, tunes from the days before the war swallowed their lives. The sound cut through the heavy atmosphere, pulling a few American medics into glances of curiosity. One even asked haltingly what the song was. Adler, surprised, answered simply, "Brahms." The medic only nodded, as though some invisible thread had connected them across language and allegiance. The Americans gave them no praise, only more patience. Yet slowly, small gestures began to pierce the wall of suspicion. A guard once left an extra piece of bread near Adler's cot. Another passed Keller a cigarette without speaking. Tiny mercies, unnoticed by command, but felt deeply by men who expected nothing but hostility. Then came the night that tested everything. A truck arrived from the front, its bed packed with wounded Americans, snow caked into their uniforms. Among them was a sergeant whose chest had been torn open by shrapnel. The wound was catastrophic, lungs punctured, ribs broken. The American major barked an order, pointing straight at Keller. "You, save him." Keller froze. To attempt the surgery with the crude tools at hand was madness. Failure seemed certain. And if the sergeant died under his hands, suspiciate, iron would become accusation. His throat tightened as he prepared his instruments, sweat beading despite the cold. Vogel and Adler hovered nearby, ready to assist. For 2 hours, time ceased to exist. They cut, stitched, drained. Keller's fingers ached from holding clamps. Blood darkened the straw beneath the stretcher. Finally, the sergeant's breathing steadied, shallow but unmistakably alive. Keller sagged, too weary even to lift his head. Around him, silence fell. The Americans had watched every move, rifles half raised, as if waiting for betrayal. Now they lowered their weapons. The major gave a short nod. No words of thanks, only a glance that said more than language could. That night, Vogel whispered, "You realize, Fritz, you just saved the man who might shoot your countrymen tomorrow." Keller wiped his spectacles and whispered back, "Better a man breathing than a man gone. That has always been our work." Still, suspicion lingered like smoke. Days later, an American corporal grew feverish and accused Vogel of poisoning him. The barn erupted in shouts, rifles raised once more. Vogel's face went grey with terror. He shouted in broken English, "No poison! Infection! Already infection!" The tension stretched like a bowstring until an American doctor confirmed Vogel's claim. The rifles lowered. But Vogel shook for hours afterward, muttering, "I thought I would die in the straw tonight." And yet, mercy continued to appear where they least expected it. One evening, an American guard approached with a tin cup of steaming coffee. He placed it on the table near the Germans and walked away without a word. Vogel wrapped his hands around it, the heat searing his palms, tears pricking his eyes. For a moment, the war felt far away. Then came another test, harsher than any before. A stretcher arrived carrying a wounded German prisoner, one of their own countrymen. His leg was mangled beyond saving. Without amputation, he would be dead by dawn. The Americans stood back, watching carefully. Would the German doctors save their own? Would they perform such a brutal procedure under the eyes of the enemy? Keller's hands shook as he prepared the saw. The soldier begged weakly in German, "Don't take my leg." Adler pressed his hand to the man's shoulder. "Better no leg than no life." The amputation was swift but harrowing. The soldiers' screams rang against the rafters until morphine dulled them into silence. When it was over, the American major surprised them by handing Adler a bottle of the precious drug. "For him," the major said. The gesture shook them more than any rifle could have. That night, Adler wrote in his hidden notebook, "We thought they would kill us. Instead, they trust us with their wounded and even our own. I do not know what world I live in anymore." The work never slowed. Day after day, they treated strangers who spoke in tongues they barely understood. Yet in those moments, blood on their hands, breath rattling in their ears, the language of medicine was enough. At the end of December, rumors swept the camp. The German offensive was faltering. The Ardennes would soon be lost. The three doctors huddled together, wondering what that meant for them. Execution? Transfer deeper into captivity? Or perhaps, though they hardly dared imagine, survival until the WWII's end. Their answer came in a blunt order from the American major. The interpreter's words were simple. "Tomorrow you march forward with us. We need you." Keller stared in disbelief. "Forward? Into the American lines?" The major's face was hard. "You swore an oath as doctors. We will hold you to it. You will save lives, not take them. That is why you are still breathing." That night, Keller wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we march not as free men, not as condemned, but as doctors bound by an oath that no rifle can erase. The enemy trusts us with their wounded. Perhaps trust is the strangest mercy of all." The first morning of January 1945 was cold enough to freeze the breath on a man's moustache. The world seemed locked in white silence, broken only by the groan of trucks and the barked orders of officers. Into this harsh dawn, the three German doctors, Keller, Vogel, and Adler, marched alongside American medics. They were prisoners, yes, but their hands were no longer bound. Their captors had strapped medical satchels across their shoulders, as if reminding them every step that their survival depended on what those hands could do. They moved with an American convoy eastward, deeper into the war's bleeding heart. Each mile carried them away from the certainty of execution, but not into freedom, into something stranger, suspended between loyalty to the Reich that had collapsed behind them and the obligations of their oath as physicians. The first test came before the sun reached its peak. A farmhouse had been converted into a triage station. Dozens of wounded Americans lay across its wooden floors, groaning through morphine haze or muttering fevered prayers. Keller and Vogel were pushed inside, told to work. The air smelled of smoke, antiseptic, and something raw, blood in quantities that blurred the line between battle and slaughterhouse. Keller knelt beside a boy who could not have been more than 18. Shrapnel had carved deep into his side, ribs shattered. The boy's lips moved soundlessly, as though calling for his mother. Keller whispered back in German, words the boy could not understand but might feel. "Hold fast, Junge. I will not leave you." Hours later, the boy breathed easier, stitched and bandaged. When Keller looked up, he saw an American medic watching. The young man gave a short nod. Not thanks, not friendship, but acknowledgement. That was enough. Adler found himself in the cellar where the air was damp and freezing. There he encountered his first German patient in days, an unconscious Panzer grenadier with both arms mangled. The Americans had dragged him in alongside their own, making no distinction except the color of cloth on his collar. Adler's hands hesitated. Saving this man meant prolonging the fight against the very soldiers who were now watching Adler's every move. Yet when he set the bones, when he cleaned the wounds, his mind cleared. He was no longer treating German or American. He was simply keeping a man alive against the odds of war. That night, Vogel scribbled on a scrap of wrapping paper, his handwriting jagged from fatigue. "I no longer know who the enemy is. Perhaps it is not the man bleeding on the stretcher. Perhaps it is only the war itself." The Americans treated them with a mix of suspicion and necessity. Guards still carried rifles, their eyes sharp with instinct. But in quieter moments, cracks appeared in the wall between captor and captive. A medic from Ohio shared cigarettes with Vogel, lighting one for himself and one for the German doctor without speaking. Adler once found a crust of bread left at his station, too cleanly placed to be accident. Keller overheard a chaplain murmur, "If they save one of ours, let God judge the rest." But not all Americans accepted their presence. At another station near Bastogne, an American officer stormed into the surgery room, shouting at the major who commanded the unit. His brother had been killed in a German ambush the week before. He demanded the Germans be sent outside, lined against the wall. His rage filled the room, a raw grief sharpened into vengeance. The major stood firm. "They're doctors, Captain. They've saved more of ours than you can count." The younger officer spat on the ground but left without further word. The Germans felt the weight of his eyes long after. The war itself pressed relentlessly forward. Trucks carried the wounded day and night, and the 3 German doctors became fixtures in the rhythm of American medical life. They assisted in amputations, drained infections, and performed surgeries that blurred into one another. Their German language became studied with halting English, scalpel, bandage, morphine. Slowly, communication ceased to be a barrier. One night in early January, as snow thickened outside, Keller was called to a small room where an American colonel lay unconscious. A sniper's bullet had shattered his shoulder. His men hovered anxiously, their faces grim. "If he dies," one whispered, "they'll blame the Krauts." Keller's heart thudded. The operation lasted hours. He cut away bone fragments, stemmed the bleeding, stitched with painstaking care. At last the colonel breathed evenly, his pulse steady. Keller's hands shook so violently afterwards that Adler had to steady him. When dawn broke, the colonel's eyes flickered open. He murmured a word in English, too faint for Keller to understand. The interpreter leaned close, then repeated softly in German, "Danke." Keller felt something hot sting his eyes. The next day, a nurse slipped him a note written in rough German. "You gave him back to us. We will not forget." The war did not pause for gratitude. Every mile forward revealed new horrors. In one village, Keller stumbled upon civilians huddled in a church basement, their faces gaunt with hunger. The Americans brought bread. Keller, moved by impulse, offered his own ration to a crying child. The boy took it with wide eyes. Keller thought of his daughter back in Stuttgart, who might even then be huddling in some cellar, waiting for sirens to fade. For Vogel, the turning point came when a German prisoner lashed out. The man spat in his face, snarling that Vogel was a traitor for saving Americans. Guards rushed forward, rifles ready, but Vogel waved them off. He wiped his cheek, his expression hollow. "If being a traitor means keeping men alive," he whispered, "then I will bear that name." That night he wrote in his diary, "We heal the enemy. Our countrymen call us traitors. But what is treason against war if it is loyalty to life?" January bled into February. Rumors of the Reich's collapse spread like wildfire. The Germans listened in silence as American radios crackled with reports. Cities bombed, armies shattered, surrender looming. For the doctors, each rumor was a reminder that the world they had sworn allegiance to was crumbling faster than their hands could stitch flesh together. Then came an order that none of them expected. The Americans had set up a large field hospital in an abandoned monastery. Dozens of cots filled the chapel, the crucifix above watching over men in agony. The German doctors were given near full rein, working side by side with American staff. The line between prisoner and physician blurred to the point of vanishing. Keller led one moment with painful clarity. A young American private, delirious with fever, gripped his hand and muttered words Keller did not understand. An interpreter translated, "He says, 'Don't leave me, Doc.'" Keller stayed through the night, holding the boy's hand until the fever broke. Another day, Adler overheard 2 American nurses whispering about him. One said, "Hard to believe he's the enemy. He looks more tired than we do." The other replied, "War makes enemies. Medicine makes neighbors." Still, suspicion never fully died. One evening, guards discovered that Adler had kept a tiny notebook of observations, sketches of surgical procedures, notes on American medical techniques. They accused him of espionage. Adler stammered, insisting they were only the habits of a doctor, a man desperate to remember the science of survival. After a tense interrogation, the major intervened, vouching for Adler. "If he wanted to betray us, he's had 100 chances. Let him write." Adler's notebook was returned, pages smudged with dirt but intact. By March, the end was near. The front pushed deep into Germany. One night, Keller dreamed of his family, the house in Stuttgart he might never see again. He woke with tears on his cheeks, ashamed until Vogel murmured, "I dreamed of home too." They sat in silence, prisoners bound not by chains, but by memory. When the surrender finally came in May, the war's roar collapsed into an exhausted silence. The 3 German doctors were formally listed as prisoners of war, slated for processing. Yet the Americans who had fought beside them, not with rifles but with scalpels, spoke on their behalf. Nurses signed statements, medics wrote letters. Even the colonel whose life Keller had saved gave testimony. They were our doctors as much as theirs. The doctors were transferred to a larger POW camp, but treated with an unusual respect. Eventually they were repatriated to Germany. The journey home was a blur of ruined cities, rubble where neighborhoods once stood, families shattered. Yet the memory they carried was different. Not the memory of rifles and firing squads, but of candles flickering over stretchers, of voices speaking thanks in a language they barely understood. Years later, each would tell the story differently. Adler recalled the cold nights when enemy nurses shared bandages. Vogel spoke of the moment he was called a traitor and realized it was the truest honor he'd ever earned. Keller remembered the boy from Kansas, the diary filled with harvest dreams, and the whispered word Danke from a man who should have hated him. What lingered was not ideology, not the commands of leaders who had long since perished in disgrace, but the fragile truth that mercy could emerge in the unlikeliest of places. Keller wrote in his final diary before returning to civilian practice, "We were captured. We expected death. Instead, we were asked to heal. History will count numbers, battalions lost, shells fired, cities burned. Let this page record what cannot be measured. 3 German doctors who, for a season, were not enemies but physicians. We were stunned not by cruelty, but by mercy. And that mercy, small as a flame in a winter storm, has burned in me ever since.